Hi, and welcome to the first episode in our Learn to Knit series. In this episode, we're going to learn how to cast on. Now, casting on is the method of creating our foundation row of stitches, which we then work into afterwards. In this video, we're going to learn two different cast on methods. We're going to learn a 2-needle cast on and a 1-needle cast on. You can do either when you're casting on, whichever you prefer. So I'm going to start with the 2-needle cast on. So we are beginning with our 2-needle cast on. So for this, I've got our yarn and I've got our end just here. So to begin this, first thing we're going to do is make a slip knot. So to create our slip knot, we want to take our end of yarn and just work a little bit of the way in, so maybe about 20 centimetres. And working from here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wrap this just around these 2 fingers. Now in doing this, I've created a little circle. Now this circle is the foundation of our slip knot. So then taking the yarn with the end, I'm then going to take this to the back of the circle, and then I'm just going to pick that up and pull it through. And that has created our slip knot. So I'll show you that again. So starting a little bit of the way in, I'm taking the yarn, wrapping it around my 2 fingers, creating a little circle, taking the yarn to the back of the work, then pulling it through and creating our slip knot. Now this is our first stitch. So as we're doing the 2-needle cast on, I'm going to slip this on to our first needle, and then you can just kind of pull either side, and then it should just be nice and snug on your needle, but not too tight that you can't really move it around. And that is our first stitch created. So now as we're working into the next stitches to create our foundation row, we've got our 2 ends. We've got what we call the tail. This is the end which is not attached to the yarn. And then we've got what we call our working yarn, which is our longer end, which is actually attached to the ball of wool. When doing this next step, always make sure that you're working with the working yarn. So I'm going to grab our other needle as we're doing the 2-needle cast on method. So I've got 1 needle in each hand, and I've got our first stitch here. So to create our next stitch, I'm taking the empty needle, so our right hand needle, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop this needle through our first stitch. So we're just popping it through. There we go. Then I'm taking our working yarn, so the yarn that's attached to the ball, and I'm just literally just going to wrap this over the needle, like so. Then we're taking our left hand needle and we're just going to slip this off, as so. And then what we've done is create a new loop out of this stitch, you see? Now this is our second stitch. So the final step is just to slip this stitch onto our left hand needle, and now we have 2 stitches. Now there's a few steps there, so I'll just go through that again for you. So step number 1, we're taking our empty needle, our right hand needle, popping it through the next stitch, so from front to back, so it's through our stitch. Then we're taking our working yarn, popping it over this needle, and then taking our needle, popping it over that needle, then we have a new loop formed. Then final step, slip this loop back onto the left hand needle, and you've got a new stitch. And you just carry on as so until you've got as many stitches as the patterns require. So we'll go again. Needle through the front of the stitch to the back, yarn round the needle, slip off, new loop created, slip onto left hand needle. We now have 4 stitches. Let's carry on as so. So needle through stitch, yarn over, slip off, slip on to left hand needle. Needle through stitch, yarn over, slip off, new loop created, yarn onto left hand needle. And you just carry on as so. When doing this, try not to make it too tight, as then you'll find that it'll be difficult to work into afterwards. So you want it kind of nice and snug, but not too tight. So we'll go again. Needle through the stitch, yarn over, slip off, new loop created, slip on to left hand needle. Needle through stitch, yarn round needle, slip off, new loop created, yarn onto left hand needle. And that is a 2-needle cast on. So now we've learnt our 2-needle cast on, we're now going to move on to the 1-needle cast on. So we can take one of these needles away for now. So we're going to start this cast on a very similar way to what we did to the last one. So we're going to create our slip knot. but we've got one main difference. So if you remember when we created the slip knot on the first cast on method, we started our knot about 20 centimetres in from the end of the yarn. Now with this cast on, it's a bit more dependent on how many stitches you have to how long you leave this tail at the end. So I'm just going to pull a little bit more, so we've got a nice kind of about 50 or so centimetres there to work from. And this is where we're going to start doing our slip knot. So we're going to do it exactly the same way as last time. So I'm just going to wrap the yarn around my 2 fingers, create our circle, bring the yarn to the back of the work and pull through. And there our slip knot has been created. And again, we're just going to slip this onto our needle. This time I'm going to hold the needle in my right hand. There we go. So the stitch has been slipped onto the needle and a first stitch has been created. Now this method uses both our 2 ends of yarn. So it uses our tail and uses our working yarn. So I'm going to show you as I go with this one. So what we do to create our next stitch, instead of working into the slip knot, we are working on our tail of yarn, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wrap the tail of yarn around my thumb, so we're creating a little circle, and then going to put this onto the needle. So that is our first loop. We're then going to take the working yarn at this side. I'm going to bring this forward around the needle, so we've now got 2 loops, and then you're passing the loop over the working yarn, and your next stitch has been created. We'll go again. So I'm taking the tail end of the yarn, wrapping it around my thumb, popping this onto the needle, so we've got a loop on the needle, taking the working yarn, wrapping this around the needle, then pull the loop off and tighten, and another stitch has been created. We go once again, so yarn around the thumb, slip onto the needle, yarn around the needle, slip the loop off, another stitch created, yarn around the thumb, yarn around the needle, slip loop off, tighten, another stitch created. And you'll just carry on as so until you've got as many stitches as needed. So we'll go again, yarn around the thumb, slip onto the needle, yarn around the needle, slip loop off, tighten as needed. And this creates a very similar method of cast on to our 2 needle cast on. So we'll keep going, yarn around the thumb, slip onto the needle, yarn around the needle, slip off, new stitch created, yarn around the thumb, slip onto the needle, yarn around the needle, slip off, new stitch created, and so forth. This is why it's more dependent on how long you want to leave your tail, because the more stitches you have, the more yarn you will need in the tail area of the yarn. So rule of thumb, just kind of use more than you'll think you'll need, and you should be okay. So that is our 1 needle cast on method.